Hey, it's Tuesday. You know, as I always like reminding people, what you got to do is not mess around with your video setup on the day that you're recording. Otherwise, you'll be very late. And to that note, let's start off what we're gonna do today, or rather, I'm gonna do today. And that is, I'm working on this new little booklet, The Legacy Trap, with one of my coworkers, Mark Zotner. And I thought today we would do a little bit of a watch party and watch. It's an older presentation, but what I found is that this stuff doesn't really age. Sort of ideas of how to modernize portfolios and the processes that you go through when you're trying to improve the way you do IT, all these sorts of things. So I thought we would watch it. It's from 2017, I believe, and it is actually, he's been on here before. This guy Henri, actually, he used to work at Charles Schwab at the time, and now he works here. So you'll see him in it. Looks like he's using the same profile picture, which is fun. But anyhow, let's get into it here. You'll see me taking some notes alongside this. So let's start it off. I'll of course make sure. So let's start it off. I'll of course make sure. So let's start it off. I'll of course make sure. So let's start it off.
So we wanted to make sure we put our faces on the slide so you have trouble distinguishing between us. Henri's the taller one, obviously. When we first submitted a request to Pivotal to present here at Spring One, we were pretty bold and we asked for a keynote. And they said no. And so we said, well, what if we wear a hoodie? And they said no. And then we said, well, what about a hoodie and maybe a t-shirt?
These were good jokes. I mean, I guess they still are, but that was, people like James Waters, big, he's still around, of course, but he was famous for wearing a hoodie all the time. Because, that's what one does in the San Francisco area there. On with the jokes.
Like an ironic technology t-shirt for an hour. And again, they said no. So they ended up giving us a 30-minute time slot at 5 o'clock. And we agreed to put stickers on our computers. So I put a .NET sticker on my computer.
Now, I'm well, for Spring One and other things, I'm on a lot of conference selection stuff. And, it's odd. I also presented a lot of conferences. But when I am thinking about conference presentations, I'm thinking about the recording that gets made. It's fun to present to an audience. It's kind of like, part of it. But as I'm demonstrating here, to me, having a recording in YouTube is really what the value for giving a talk is, because more people can see it. It's something, it documents what's going on. You can show it off to people. But yeah, it is nice to have an audience, meaning that like whatever time you're presenting, whatever time I'm presenting, I'm not always too concerned about what it is, but that is a good joke to use that they've scheduled you at the end, or the famous one to joke about is it's after lunch, so everyone's going to be in a coma or whatever, but on with it.
So we wanted to give you guys a little bit of insight into some of the stuff that Schwab is doing, particularly as it relates to modernization and our migration to cloud. Some of the lessons that we have learned, some of the approaches that we have been taking to hopefully give you some insight as you go through this journey. I'm sure a lot of you are probably already going through a similar journey, but maybe we can provide a little bit more insight into our approach and the tactics that we're taking.
So before we start, we want to get a sense. So you got to get a sense of who Charles Schwab is. You guys have probably heard of our name.
Let's get better quality.
But we started off with a humble beginning in about 1975, and with a basic premise to say it's all about the client. And part of that, we take that very seriously, passionately, that everything we do, we kind of look through the client's eyes and see what the experiences are. Now that's a critical point because we then see what the clients are seeing. We're delivering the right capabilities, right experiences for our clients. Now, because of that and that simple vision,
Now I'm a Schwab client. I have my some of my stuff over there. They seem fine. They're actually pretty. I enjoy using their platform. So sure.
Been able to grow as an organization. We're currently one of the largest financial investment firms, publicly traded. And as you can see, we have up to $3.2 trillion in assets that we manage for our clients. So you can see it's very important for us to continue to focus on that. So our migration and cloud-native approach views it in the same way as well. So to put it in context of the size of the organization, we really split down into three main parts.
We'll speed it up a little
One is
bit.
the investment services side of the house. So those are kind of your classical brokerage side. We also have the retirement services side. So think about your 401ks. And finally, also the advisor services side of the house. And that's a large portfolio there as well. But whatever we do, we continue to focus back on how the client sees things. So what we're going to go through, we'll demonstrate to you as well that we constantly focus on that. We want to continue to have the client have the best experience while we go through this. So with this, why don't we get started?
So let's take a look at the technology. We're not going to go into details, but as with any large organization, you can imagine Schwab has and continues to explore technology. So a 40-year-old company had grew up on legacy systems. So you can imagine that this large ecosystem of both, I would say, distributed and legacy mainframe systems exists today. So the problem that we have is how do we go about trying to decompose those and modernize it while we're not impacting the client? And that's the important piece, as Henri mentioned, is that we need to look at this through the client's eyes, but we don't want to impact them. So we have this enormous ecosystems of, you name it, we probably have used it or use it, distributed solutions, mainframe solutions, et cetera.
So let's play a game. So this is the part that gets interactive. So I'm glad that all of you guys showed up. We kind of said it during the keynote already, which we didn't get, by the way. We're not sure about this by any means. But as part of the keynote, one of the great sessions was also, let's do a gameplay. And it plays very well with what we're going to be talking about. So show of hands, what is this? Okay, football field, right? So let's use it as our gameplay. So let's go through this, and we'll use this as an analogy. So John and I tend to use a lot of analogies, especially what we do in the day-to-day world. So just be very applicable. So let's go through it. John?
What is this? Anybody? A play. Why is a play important? Why do football teams use plays? Plan of attack? Perfect. Okay.
Okay. So, great. We're going to play. Did I just play one play? So what is this? Playbook. Oh, you guys, nobody got paid for this? Right? Fantastic. This is a playbook. It consists of a couple of different plays. Great. I've got a couple of different plays that I can play. Now what?
So do you think offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators get paid just to use a set number of plays in a fixed order?
Wow, look at that. They're going back and forth, and it seems natural. They've practiced this. It's hard to be on cue and pass back and forth without reading in that kind of stilted, scripted voice, or not reading, but presenting. So that's nice. And here we are building the playbook. I suppose we're going to take plays of modernization and put it together in a playbook, which is indeed part of what we recommend. We call it a cookbook, but I think it's good to start documenting that stuff along the way.
No, they really don't. So they need to understand when to use a given play at a certain time in order to move their team down the field and achieve an objective. So they have a playbook, but the art and the science is really when to use that play appropriately.
So great. So we got a playbook. Doesn't mean you become a great team, right? Now, we live in Denver, so Broncos are doing that good. So
smooth
we're helping
pass
them,
off.
I'm serious. So we got the playbook, but when we look at the monolith, how do you use what part of the play? What is good? Keep in mind, we need to have things keep on running for the clients, but which one do we pick? Right? We need some guidance around this. So let's explore that a little more.
So what's the solution? Well, pretty simply, you could just stop using X's and O's and start using hexagons. Wouldn't that work? No.
Yep.
So you can move down the field this way. Basically, you need a way to decompose your application, continue to use that analogy, to move it down the field in order to achieve what your end state is.
So great. So we've appeased all the project managers, right? Take the big hexagon, move it down the field, declare victory, right? Well, there's a little bit more to it. So we follow a basic three-step approach. We first make an assessment, look what we can use, and then apply them. So it's like basic archaeology, right? Is you kind of need to know where you're at before you start digging, and then you start implementing these things. So with that, why don't we dive into a little bit more detail so you get a better appreciation of how we go about doing this.
So as we said before, it's almost like an archaeology effort in some cases, especially for a company that's 40 years old. We often say to teams, you need to understand where you are before you know where you're going. And so this is an important step in our process and in our approach. So it's really more of an assessment of the application and the infrastructure and what the application ecosystem looks like. And so you can see there's some various things that we want teams to consider.
All right, so that's a good quote to use. So start with an assessment. You need to understand where you are. Let's see what he says. I mean, it's,
Step in our process and in our approach.
Of how we go about doing this.
So as we said before, it's almost like an archaeology effort in some cases, especially for a company that's 40 years old. We often say to teams, you need to understand where you are before you know where you're going. And so this is an important step in our process and in our approach. It's really more of an assessment of the application and the infrastructure and what the application ecosystem looks like. And so you can see there's some various things that we want teams to consider when they're looking to determine what their current state is. So going into what are all the it's really more of an assessment of the application and the infrastructure and what the application ecosystem looks like. And so you can see there's some various things that we want teams to consider when they're looking to determine what their current state is. So going into what are all the use cases. This is an important step in our...
I'll get into a little bit more detail so you got a better appreciation.
This is how it works. Right in the book, you got to capture text.
As we said before, it's almost like an archaeology effort in some cases, especially for a company that's 40 years old. We often say to teams, you need to understand where you are before you know where you're going. And so this is an important step in our process.
In our process.
And in our approach.
So this is John Berry. Charles Schwab. So here you see you can take this and kind of use it as a, instead of me saying it or my co-authors, you can have him say it, which, you know, I think is much nicer. John Berry of Charles Schwab. You can also kind of cut that out. So this is an important. Yep. All right. Now let's see what they do here.
It's really more of an assessment of the application and the infrastructure and what the application ecosystem looks like. And so you can see there's some various things that we want teams to consider when they're looking to determine what their current state is. So going into what are all the use cases that this application supports, some of the application, its ecosystem, meaning its context, what are the components associated with it. And then right away, we always get the question of, well, why are you doing all of this effort and not being more agile? And let me be clear that we're not saying that you shouldn't be agile even in this archaeological approach and understanding what the architecture looks like, but you need to understand, again, exactly where you are. And if you can't do that, again, you don't know where you're going to go.
There's an interesting point there. I don't know if I'm going to do anything with it, but let's see. What's his name? Barry notes that this may not seem agile to some, but it's crucial to understand where you're starting from. The use cases for the apps, the infrastructure, stacks they use, etc. You don't need to get bogged down in it, but you need to know it, to find it. Let's say find and define. Find and define those definitions, or archaeology, as they say.
So with that, during the conference, you guys already hear, like, install some Spring Cloud services, right? Full 12-factor greenfield approach to your problem, right? Everybody has this problem, right? We can start just like Twitter, no big deal. Well, wait a minute. We 40-year-old company, we have a lot of systems. How do you go from A to B? Well, part of that evaluation, you should ask yourself the question, like, where am I at on the spectrum, right? Because not one solution fits all problems. You want to look at the fact of, on one side, am I just replacing the technology? And the other side, am I going full cloud native, right? Now, do you think for everything you need to go full cloud native? Probably not, right? There's a lot of things in there that you're somewhere on the spectrum. To help determine and ascertain that decision, you got to make some trade-offs in certain areas. So we've copyrighted this diagram. And we didn't, sorry. But it's an illustration to help gauge you where you're at with your application to determine how far do you go and how much do you really need to do. And that's key when we start talking about next is the implementation pieces.
So once you've understood really what the rules of the field are, meaning that you would never see, as an example, you never see a receiver come off the field, go out of bounds, and score a touchdown.
Let's go back to that, because that, what do we have here? I'm going to go full screen here. And are we, okay, it hasn't chopped that off. So, return on investment, cost, time, scalability, agility, effort. And then I assume, is this time? I should ask Henri what this is. So this is meant to be a description of additional considerations associated with making modernization systems. Line grade and attributes are subjective. So So this is the cost to do full modernization, replatforming. Doesn't cost much, but it also doesn't get you much. Now, I don't know what this line in the middle is. So your return on investment is going to be more if you do, and by full modernization, they probably mean, rewriting and things like that. So your total cost of ownership is going to be low. Cost of maintenance is low. So this is an interesting slide to contemplate. So what's going on here is they have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 attributes to judge an application. This is a kind of a weird chart because usually like a line chart like this, you assume it's a time series chart, that this is time going forward. But whatever. So erase that out of your mind. This is not time. And instead, what would be more appropriate here? Pie charts would be interesting because they would show you the benefits of these other things relative to the other ones faster. Maybe a Mako chart. Anyways. So essentially what it's saying is that, this is a weird chart. So there are some applications, the application A, you're going to get little benefit for the money you pay for it up here, right? So you don't get, you don't get huge improvements relative to other things. Is that right? See, this chart's hard to read. But over here, so for application B, we did a lot more rewriting and things of it. And the payoff was, but cost is bad. So the time it took was longer. The effort was more. But I guess really what you want to pay attention to is return on investment and cost and time. So scalability, agility, effort, and return on investment are the good ones. And the gray ones are the bad ones. I mean, in the cost, we would always prefer to pay nothing or be paid to do something rather than have to pay it on its own. So the TCO and the cost of maintenance. So you're gonna reduce costs over here. You're going to raise costs because you have to pay for people to do this development. See, time is also negative, like the amount of time it takes, but whatever. But then you have all these big gains. I should just talk to him about this because that's there's some good attributes in here. So let me put this in. Attributes that Schwab uses when ranking, when analyzing applications. Trade-offs between, let's see, how much modernization effort is put in versus costs, TCO, and benefits. So, let's see, for book, let's see, list these attributes as one model. Maybe. That's around, let's call it 9, right? So this is my own personal time code tracking system. Put things in parentheses. And of course the tilde, I forget where I picked this up, but it means approximate in some notation system.
So once you've understood really what the rules of the field are, meaning that you would never see, as an example, you never see a receiver come off the field, go out of bounds, and score a touchdown from out of bounds. So you need to understand really what the rules of the game are. You need to watch game film. And what I mean by that, again, is just determining from a strategy perspective, what is your strategy and what's going to tell you what is modern. So for example, if you haven't evaluated cloud and cloud is not a part of your strategy, then that's not going to help you. But if you say it's a combination, maybe hybrid cloud, you understand what modern is to you and your applications. The other thing is understanding patterns. What patterns or plays can I follow in order to help us achieve? And this is more of the how. So we always talk about things in terms of what is modern, but then also how to achieve a modern state. So the plays, the playbooks, the patterns that we talk to teams about are really how do I get there?
That's kind of fun. So I don't really know what to do with that, but 10, 20. Define what is modern so that you can start to analyze from a common understanding. Let's see, for legacy trap, we have the 7 R's that define that. We should add that defining, let's see, having a shared definition with the team is important. And then what is, okay, let's see. Let's just say go and get the quote from Barry that makes this point. All right.
So we kind of know the how, we know some of the patterns. But if I just tell a team, like the Denver Broncos, and just go ahead and do these, well, they need some structure in the playbook. So we're being pretty prescriptive in our playbooks to help describe what patterns are there and give us some level of organization as well. And that organization allows us to put things in context as well. Like, great, I've got a strangulation pattern. Do I use it all the time? Probably not. There's only certain cases you do it. So we actually organize it so that it becomes very applicable to which patterns to use when, and also which patterns are correlated to each other that you can combine together as well, making it for a more conducive playbook.
So now how does it all fit together? And so you understand the rules, you understand what modern is, you know how to get there, and now you need to implement it. And this is really, again, where art and science kind of merge, and I call it this negative space between what is modern versus how to get there. And so again, you really need to understand, as you're going down this journey, when to use certain plays at the right time. In certain instances, let's say on a third down, you may want to call a go route versus just trying to run it for short yardage. So again, this is where art and science come together, and this is where offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators get paid the big bucks.
So great, so now you have the playbook. You can now say, we've got a hexagon as well. And now you can take the different pieces in the hexagon and deliberately go through it and select what patterns of the playbook you're applying. So now you can have a game. You guys ready to play? All right. So having said all this, we've kind of gone through this journey. We are putting the playbooks together.
Metaphors.
And teams are leveraging those as well. So there's only a couple of things we want to share with you guys. What have we learned as part of this journey? So with that, let's kind of walk through some of the lessons learned from this process.
So one thing is being very clear on what is the definition of done. We state that up front, that every team needs to understand when they modernize, how are you defining done? And then as a consideration at the end of it on execution, you need to make sure that done is done. And what I mean by that is, let's take an example of an application that's modernized. And you've gone through this process, you have new microservices, you're adhering to that architectural style, but then you still have all that legacy stuff out there. The key here is to make sure that you're retiring that as well. The other thing I'd say is make sure that you're engaging both the technology partners, other technology partners, as well as business partners up front, meaning that if you need to get buy-in or you have other projects that are coming on board where you have contention with the projects and the modernization, you need to figure out how you're going to do that in tandem and in parallel. So getting their buy-in up front is going to be important. And then the other thing really is just making sure that resources are trained. So this is one big aspect, at least within Schwab, is that making sure that the teams that are participating in this really understand it and understand the technology and the concepts that you're talking about. That's a big piece.
Yeah, so in summary, so it's, a lot of it is like archaeology, but the beauty of architecture as well in this place is that you're not just focused on the technology side, right? You deal with the processy side, the business changes, the training. It's very all-encompassing that you have to take in mind. So with that, we kind of want to conclude. So one of the key messages we want to leave with you guys, keep it simple, organize it around these plays and how you can play the game. Another key shameless plug that we want to give you guys, we are hiring. We're definitely hiring more than some of the other financial institutions that are here during this conference.
Boy, really
so come check us out. It's a great environment to work in. There's also a lot of Schwabies here in the audience that are glad to kind of share what we're doing. With that, we'll be glad to kind of take some questions.
Let's see what 15 minutes of questions is.
Sure. So the question is, are there repeated patterns or learnings of problems that you run into moving to the cloud?
I would say one big thing is foundational items. So making sure that, again, as I said, that you, depending on your strategy, that certain foundational items like hosting platforms, et cetera, that you've already said are strategic, that are in place. Because if you don't have those, obviously, teams are going to struggle. And that includes both the solution and the software itself, but then also the process around that. So making sure that teams can onboard to a given platform is going to be vitally important to have that up front. Patterns is just really more, I would say, from the patterns that we've been exploring, is more education. So explaining to teams the value in doing this, and that there may be some implementation details that vary depending on the pattern. And it's come up quite a few times. Take, for example, if we implemented a router and anti-corruption layer and use a repository interface, some teams sometimes want to do this in actual physical constructs versus logical constructs, and making sure you can distinguish between the two and when to use them, when not to.
Yeah, that's kind of a key point what John is making, is that you want to make sure you're clear and deliberate on those things, make it simpler as well. I think the other part too is a little bit of an eyes wide open with all these things, is that what we typically call is some.
Make sure you're clear and deliberate on these things. Let's see, as Matt Stein puts it in whatever little post he had. Make the right things the desire paths. Make them easy. So the point here being that, like, I mean, I think what they're saying is that you need to make sure you have all the, they say foundational, but all of the tools in place and the practices so that as people are modernizing, which is a hard enough job as on its own, they're not having to invent, pipelines and CI/CD and the platform they run on, and you put that in place to help them out as much as possible, so that the infrastructure layer, the platform, isn't part of the modernization. Let's see. Let me put in place a platform and continually improve it. Platform as a product, so that people don't have to worry about their infrastructure stuff and dev tools as part of this process. They'll have enough to worry about without, let's say, without building a cloud from scratch. A cloud and a platform. Let's see, a cloud, a platform, and a development methodology. Yeah, so I think what we can do here, you need to lay a foundation. Okay.
Things that we're talking about with cloud native, you're going to go from a 101 course to like a 401 course all of a sudden on implementation. You don't just do that overnight, right? You want to be deliberate. You want to make sure that people understand those concepts. I mean, it was said already before, distributed computing is hard. And if you really, I tend to enjoy that part, is that the 7 fallacies of distributed computing, keep that in mind, right? It's not an easy CF push to a certain extent. There's a lot more other things you have to take care of as part of your architecture. Great question. Any other questions?
In the back.
Yeah, so the question is, how was the funding done for this particular effort? We made a deliberate effort of actually turning this into a large program to do modernization.
But that's not to say that we encourage teams and actually guide them to also do modernization, even with project-based stuff, so that both project-based stuff as well as this larger program are all trying to drive the ships in the same direction.
Yeah. It's definitely not an all or nothing. It's a destination that everybody's moving towards. Yeah. Great question.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's a good question. So depending on the platform, we will and potentially do change teams. And so we're trying to remove their focus on production support items, if I understand your question correctly. So teams could adjust to be independent and have their own production support, or more centralized. It varies. Does that answer your question, or is it related to something else? No, that's good.
Yeah, there's definitely more of a notion that the teams own more of their own destination. Yeah. Question over here. That's a good question. So the question is that how do you, let me just call it evergreen, the document. So the way we set the first foundational aspect of it, and I'll address the socialization aspect first. We tend to do roadshows within the firm as well, where we go around the different service centers to make sure that everybody understands what these things are to set the foundation. With that as well, we get a lot of input from all the other individuals, so a lot of the architects in the firm, and we take that input to then enhance the patterns as well. And it's a continuous effort where we actually create a backlog around this as well. Because we have no illusions that it's a one and done. It's a continuing evolving, depending on the situations, depending on the modernization that's going on as well. And when we find certain challenges, we go step back, identify what are the patterns.
So that's like a pattern that I've identified that many companies do, is to have internal conferences or road shows, as he says. I always recommend just doing it every quarter. Pretty big, all the relevant people invited, and yourselves presenting about the progress, not only training about what it is, but also going over the lessons learned and getting people, actual individuals from the various software teams, to talk about their experience, to do their own case studies.
For this,
that being important to kind of like, again, not only train people or show them how things are doing to get them all on the same page, as they've emphasized a lot in this talk, but also to build trust that the new process works, to kind of have that anecdotal sharing stories experience.
Is part of the play. Just like what you do in any team as well, right? You have to adjust and adapt for those things.
I think we have published the playbook to an internal wiki site or internal share site, and the teams, it's available for them along with the implementation and usage guidelines as we showed. But then we also go and meet with teams when needed and dive in with architects to show them, make sure that they understand the pattern and the exact implementation. Good. There's another question over here. No, not anymore.
There's a question back.
So did you migrate to off-premise or on-premise cloud? If you went off-premise, did you migrate to Facebook off-premise as well?
So we won't get into specifics on the cloud strategy, but it is a consideration, both public and private cloud. Today, we do have an on-prem solution that we're using, a very well-known one that puts on a conference. Data is still something that's under consideration. I'd say we're pretty early in the execution on that. Data under consideration as it relates to public.
But essentially the strategy, as you can kind of see, is that the focus is to be cloud native. So regardless of where you run, it should be to a certain extent immaterial. But there's obviously some things from data synchronization patterns associated with those as well.
Latency, absolutely. Yeah.
This speed of light thing.
Yeah. Other questions? So we've set forth, so the question was, what are the guidelines on technology stacks? I would say we are somewhat prescriptive in those, meaning that we say you can probably choose between one major one, potentially based on using Spring, or another one based on another company. And we try to leave some freedom for the developers to decide from a technology perspective exactly what they use.
As
long as it fits in, we kind of think of it as a road. As long as you don't
someone's
go
trying to
off
get them to
out of your
say they
lane or
run
off
on
the road, we're okay. But for the most part,
Pivotal Cloud Foundry. But they
remain
do
and
say they
still
run
stay
on
somewhat
Spring,
prescriptive
so
in
that's
that.
good.
You kind of notice this as well in one of our slides as well. When John says about the road, we kind of set up the guardrails, as long as you stay within the guardrails, that kind of ensures that we get to the end goal.
But when we notice teams, and this is what the definition of what is modern for us, if we notice teams not going the same direction as everyone else, we kind of bring them back in. Yes, sir. Yeah, so how do we continue to deliver business value even when we're modernizing? That's a very interesting question. It's hard to do, but we want to make sure that we're still, so basically the way we have it, either from an agile perspective, making sure that those are accounted for, both that the business still is going to move forward, that we're accounting for those and including those in a backlog, basically. So it's more of modernization is coming, but you need to account for it in your business processes, or in your business projects as well.
Well, how do we modernize while also addressing business value? That is customer stuff. They've worked with the business to have time, effort spent modernizing be part of the backlog schedule. That is, the business has to see this as value and plan for that work. Mixed with new features and customer-centric things. So, I mean, the real question is that could be a whole presentation. How do you do that analysis of mixing those two things together and figure out, should you do 20%, of every release cycle is modernizing things or more or whatever? But I think it probably just depends on the application and the business, all sorts of things.
Yeah, and some of the key things with that as well, and that's why we're very prescriptive, is that lift and shift doesn't quite work, right? Because you have to stop the train at that point. And we need to continue to deliver value for our clients. So the way we address it is to really figure out what are the slivers throughout the system, right? Using the plays to then figure out how do I move.
So let's see. Lift and shift doesn't work really for this approach because, because you have to shut down the system. So instead, we find the slivers. Slivers?
Bigger piece. And then it comes down to the backlog, how the teams are working, but also being delivered. We cannot just stop or just add on to what we have. We need to continue to have the end in mind, and that's what the solutions are focused on. So in some cases, that might be a little bit of it's called
to work on, mixed in with new features.
To be paid for delivering on that, but we're okay in doing that because it's keeping that end goal in mind.
Yeah, the short answer is very carefully.
Yeah. Like feeling the rocks in the river, I think.
Feeling the rocks in the river. Let's see. With a good end goal in mind, it's easier to think of the business value of modernizing. You know what I would need to do here is like ask Henri to talk more about this. I should just get him to interview and go over this stuff. So this is good point for Legacy Trap book. That being how to balance modernization effort versus new features, customer-centric changes. Obviously, having modernized apps helps end users in the same way that better wiring and piping in your house helps you without you really seeing any difference, except that your toilet stops overflowing. Ha ha ha. Let's see. But you still need to balance, let's see, visible business value with this invisible business value. Business value, business outcomes. What jargon?
It's kind of a good analogy.
Other questions?
During that modernization journey, did you think most of the time it was being technical, or was it more like cultural or process?
So the question was it challenge only in technical, or was it everything else? Yes. Keep in mind, kind of like the comment I made earlier, you're really going from a 101 course, right, to a 401 course. And that's not just on the technology side, right? It's the processes. You guys have heard of Conway's Law, how organizations are organized is how you get your solutions as well. So it's really all the above. And we bring very deliberate to also addressing all of those as part of our effort as well. Because you can't take this in isolation. So great question. Thank you. All right, we have a couple more minutes left. Any other questions?
They had a lot of questions.
We're keeping you from happy hour. All right, with that, thank you.
One more question.
So of all the applications you modernize, how many of them do you think have gone down that kind of strangler approach that lets them keep running, while you're modernizing, versus how many kind of just say, we're just going to go in and rewrite this stuff and try to refactor it and redeploy it?
Sure.
So the question was, what apps, of the apps that we're modernizing, how many are using a pattern like strangulation or others versus just pure modernization and stopping it and just pure modernization? I'd probably say the majority of them we look at are using a pattern similar to strangulation to not impact the client, just because we need to keep the wheels on the bus. We always use that analogy of we need to keep the wheels on the bus and change the engine under the hood while we're driving. And so I'd say the majority of them are actually doing that.
Yeah, it's one of the core patterns to leverage that. Great. So with that, we want to thank you guys. Check out the website. We're definitely hiring.
That's why
So
they're
it'd be
used.
great to have you join us as well on this journey. And if you have any further questions, we'll be around. And one more shameless plug. We have one great other presentation on Thursday where you guys actually get to see how we do some of these things. So join us on Thursday. Thank you so much.
Huh. Anyways, that was a good presentation. I think there's some things there. I think what I need to do is get Henri on and see if he'll answer some of my questions about that. Well, anyhow, this has been your not too long of one. If you like this episode and you've actually watched all the way to the end, if you go to tanzutalk.com, a website in sore need of updating, you can go over to videos and see the archives of all of our stuff that I've been doing. 117 or so videos, tiny ones, longer ones. It's fun to go through there and you look at the thumbnails, or I bet the one with Henri is in here somewhere. I should find that. But check out the archives if you want, or don't. And with that, I think that we'll wrap up for today. I'll be back on Thursday. Hopefully, I won't mess around with all my video stuff and delay it too long. Bye-bye.